Hello everybody, and welcome to today's video, where I'll be going over the major thematic differences between The Boys and Invincible. There's a lot of people under the impression that both of these shows are very similar to one another. They both centre around an evil Superman, they're both very violent, comedic, dramatic, and at times a little cynical, and they're both also packaged together by Amazon, so one could essentially say that Invincible was sold to them as a show very similar to The Boys. However, in my eyes the comparisons end here. I do not believe that these shows are in any way alike, aside from what has just been mentioned visually. You'll understand what I mean by this later on in the video. Quick side note, whilst I was writing this video, I felt like I was going a little too in depth regarding some of the stuff I was discussing, so I quickly just want to explain or define what I mean whenever I say subverting the superhero genre, and then hopefully everything I say in this video will be much easier to follow. Okay, so subverting the typical superhero genre essentially means that these shows are challenging or overturning the established conventions and expectations associated with typical superhero storytelling. This might involve introducing unconventional elements, questioning traditional hero tropes, or portraying characters and situations in ways that deviate from the norm. I.e., just because a person is given the powers of Spider-Man does not mean that they are going to use them powers for good. Take for example the character of Superior Spider-Man, who when gifted the powers of Spider-Man just becomes an arrogant and ruthless prick, rather than an altruistic and responsible hero. The Boys also being a perfect example, as they depict superheroes a lot like the police in real life, or at least people's perception of the police. Individuals with the power to help those in need, however, are more than likely just morally corrupt, and using said power to achieve their own goals. Hopefully this little explanation might help in understanding all I'm going to go over. I'm going to start this video off by debunking the narrative behind both of these shows being subversions of the typical superhero genre, because they're not. Well, in fact The Boys is, but I'll get onto that in a minute. See, a lot of people are under the impression that because these shows centre around a version of Superman who is very violent and evil, along with the majority of superpowered individuals themselves, the show is therefore subverting the typical superhero genre, as in say Marvel and DC Comics. Once a person gains their powers, the majority of the time they make the decision to do good with said power. Spider-Man protects the people of New York, Superman protects the people of Metropolis, simply because they have the ability to do so. However, The Boys doesn't agree with this narrative at all. They don't believe that once a person gets superpowers, they're then all of a sudden going to become superheroes, completely void of all the character traits that make a person human, i.e. the desire for power, lust, envy, love. See, the majority of The Boys' so-called superheroes aren't villainous because that's what they were prior to them being superpowered, but are actually only villainous by virtue of them being superpowered. A character in Homelander is not evil in what he hides, but is evil in the fact that he is not an outsider. And what I mean by this is that the more heroic an American Homelander acts, the more evil he becomes, as the narrative around superheroes in The Boys is that the more traditionally heroic one is, the more villainous they more than likely are, as nobody is ever truly good, regardless of what the government and society might tell you. It's essentially critiquing how traditional heroic archetype can lead to villainous outcomes, subverting the typical superhero genre, and highlighting how the pursuit of power, unchecked authority, and blind adherence to heroic norms can lead to destructive and morally compromised behaviour. To put it bluntly, in the world of The Boys, there can be no good Homelander, simply because superheroes and superhero culture is critiqued in their inherent, necessary aspects. However, this is not the case with Invincible, as it's very possible that in this world, a good Omni-Man can exist, Mark Grayson being a perfect example of that, as the narrative around superheroes is very similar to that of Marvel and DC's, with the majority of them being good, and an evil Superman existing just isn't the norm. Therefore, there isn't anything about superheroes that is such critiqued. It all just hinges around the idea that one superhero might actually be secretly evil. There also isn't anything about the superheroic nature itself that causes Omni-Man to be villainous. He instead just happens to be a superhero with villainous intent, and because of this, isn't subverting the superhero genre at all, isn't challenging or questioning tropes that have already been well established. Invincible's rather just reconstructing those tropes, in comparison to The Boys, who's completely deconstructing them. Now that I think about it, Omni-Man would honestly fit perfectly as a villain in Marvel or DC, whereas Homelander just wouldn't. His character won't be able to exist in a world which supports the idea of, say, a Captain America, as the citizens who inhabit Marvel just don't view superheroes in the same light as those who exist in the world of The Boys. Regardless, Invincible and The Boys are nowhere near alike when it comes to their so-called subversions of the typical superhero genre. Another reason I've seen as to why a lot of people believe these shows to be similar is that they're both extremely violent, and whilst this is true, they're not violent for the same reasons, or as many people believe just for the sake of being violent. I actually came across a post the other day where somebody described the boys as an allegory which uses superpowers to symbolically represent power through violence, essentially saying that the series uses superpowers to illustrate how individuals of immense power can abuse it, and how said abuse can lead to consequences for society. Very similar to the whole Scarlet Witch scene in Civil War, when she blows up that building full of innocent people. The Boys essentially uses violence to shock the viewer through the juxtaposition of realistic violent imagery. It wants you to watch Homelander butcher a group of people, and think that if superpowers were to exist in real life, this is legitimately how horrific it would look. It wants you to question whether or not somebody, good or evil, should truly have that much power over other people. Whereas Invincible uses violence not to make a point, but to rather heighten emotion. It wants you to watch Omni-Man slaughter the Guardians of the Globe and think, shit, that was horrible, why the hell would he do that? And in turn feel sad and confused, leading you to want to watch on in the hopes of all your questions being answered. It essentially uses violence to intensify melodrama, very similar to a show like, say, Game of Thrones. Another point I want to bring up is regarding the comment both shows are trying to make on the superhero genre, with the Boys acting as a satirical look on what it would be like if superheroes were to exist in real life, how they would be treated, marketed to replace athletes, celebrities, and how their public images would be built up to make us believe that they are these amazing and morally superior individuals, when in actuality, they're just people who would use all of that power for their own gain, in ways we would never believe until exposed. Very similar to the Hollywood elites, in the way that society once viewed them as these amazing individuals, until they were all exposed for being corrupt sex demons. In a way, I'd honestly argue, and I think the Boys would also agree, that the majority of us average Joes would act very similarly to the superheroes in the Boys, if we were to be given such extraordinary power, and were able to do anything without consequence. I think we would all eventually succumb to some form of corruption, simply because it's human nature. Nobody is truly all good, nor are they truly all evil. We are all just human. Invincible on the other hand takes a more basic approach when it comes to its overall message. It attempts to show us how the insanity found within modern superhero comics would affect the world, the heroes within it, and the people involved. It shows us how people would have to adapt to the bizarre world around them, dealing with horrifying enemies, while simultaneously trying to find some kind of normalcy. It's also about taking responsibility and making your own destiny based on your own ideals, a conflict Omni-Man and Mark Grayson are both currently struggling with in the show. I've seen a quote online which I believe perfectly sums up these two shows, with Invincible attempting to answer the question, how much would it suck to be a superhero? And the Boys asking, how much would it suck to be in a world with superheroes? Overall, aside from the obvious evil Superman comparison, which was broken down earlier in the video, we proved isn't even much of a comparison at all. Invincible and the Boys really don't have that much in common, and are both vastly different stories centered around an evil Superman, and those trying to stop him.
What will you have after 500 years?
You, Dad. I still have you.
Anyway, I just want to thank you all so much for watching. If you stayed to the end, please make sure to like, subscribe and turn on post notifications. And I'll see you all in the next one. Peace!